Welcome to the NewSpace India podcast, a bi-weekly talk show that exclusively captures insightful conversations with people contributing to advancement of space activities in India. The NewSpace India podcast is pleased to announce our association with Dassault Systems, a global leader in providing business and people with collaborative virtual environments to imagine sustainable innovations. Dassault Systems solutions support startups, small and medium-sized enterprises, and original equipment manufacturers in developing disruptive solutions for space launches and satellite propulsion. Recently, a supply chain digitization study with Dassault Systems was conducted to provide a foundational understanding of the supplier landscape in the Indian space ecosystem. Please use the link in the description to download the public white paper of the results of this study, which will also give you a perspective on how ready Indian suppliers are to enter the global space market. Hi, and welcome to this episode of the NewSpace India podcast. And we have Sethu here, who I know for the last couple of years, and one of the fellow entrepreneurs who's also based here in Europe. Sethu, welcome to the show.
Thanks, NP. It's a pleasure being on your show, and thanks for inviting me.
Right. And I think I met you sometime in one of these IAC conferences or one of these space conferences, and you were working at AAC Clyde at that point of time. And you had a pretty interesting background, having done a lot of research, PhD, postdoc, and everything. So tell us a little bit about, where you grew up in India and what brought you to Europe. What did you exactly do and how you got into the space sector?
Yeah, so I'm originally from Andhra. I've spent all my life in Chennai until I did my bachelor's. So I had my bachelor's in electrical engineering, and I've always been quite keen on on doing new things, be it education, be it anything else. So while I was at my bachelor's, nanotechnology was something I was quite interested in, and it was something new. It was really sort of popping up back in 2006, and then I decided to do my master's in nanotechnology, and eventually ended up at KTH in Sweden, which has a master's program in nanotechnology. So I moved to Sweden in 2010. And while I was doing my master's at KTH, there was a big research group. I think it's one of the world's renowned group in silicon carbide electronics. And then they did receive a big grant, a European grant, for making whole electronic systems based on silicon carbide for Venus exploration. And fortunately, I was hired as a PhD student there to mainly test the reliability of these electronics, both on the radiation front and also like high temperature front. So I spent about 5 years developing these materials or silicon carbide electronics for these harsh environments. And then once that was done, I thought I had enough of space and I wanted to come back to Earth. And then I was quite interested with solar cells. So I did a postdoc. I took a position at Uppsala University as a postdoc, again, developing new materials for thin film solar cells that are pretty flexible, lightweight, and foldable. So these, then about 1 year after I started my postdoc, I started realizing actually these materials could be quite good for space as well. And that's when we started testing these materials for space. And it turned out that these are pretty radiation hard. In fact, we actually published a paper where we got the best radiation hardened material so far, based on these CZTS thin copper zinc thin sulfide solar cells. So this eventually also led me to spend some time at JAXA testing these solar cells. And that's been about 8-9 years of my career. And then I thought we could start commercializing these solar cell materials, but then I hadn't had so much of contacts in space. And what I immediately realized was like having contacts is the key doing business in space. And that time, there's a company called AAC Microtech then, and now it's called AAC Clyde Space. They were just located like 2 blocks away from Uppsala University, and they were looking for a sales or a bid manager. And they eventually hired me. I spent about 1 year there. And then I ventured into ReOrbit. So that's my brief story.
Right. Thank you for that. It's fascinating that people like you start from academic and then get into business. It's a very strong position to take, and definitely something that adds value to know both the technical side as well as jump into the commercial market to get something out of it at the end. So, did you ever think that you would go back to India to be an entrepreneur, or was it natural that you studied here and in Europe, and you would stick on here to continue your venture?
No, in fact, when I started my PhD, I was actually thinking to going back to India. So I mean, I always sort of had passion for teaching, and I eventually wanted to go back to India and start teaching or have a career in teaching. But somewhere down the line, during my PhD, I did realize that the freedom that you get in Europe as a researcher is not something you would actually get in India, because I had quite a few of my colleagues or my seniors who were doing PhD in same department. They eventually ended up at IITs, and then we regularly speak with them, and that's something sort of changed my mind that probably that was not the time for me to move into India, and then I also wanted to really broaden up my scope of expertise, and then I thought, okay, let's do my postdoc, and then see how things eventually turn up then. But then, as I mentioned, while I started doing my postdoc, then we really saw some commercial value in what we were doing, and then that really sort of kicked off different things, which eventually made me to stay here now.
Right. And one of the advantages, I suppose, is that in Europe, even though you are Indian, you're open to space in that sense, unlike US, where maybe you can do some research aspects or in space science related topics or some space applications topics, but getting into the hardware sector like you did is very difficult, right?
Yes, yeah, definitely. That's very true. I mean, again, if you look at like the Indian market, also, I mean, the market in Scandinavia, where I was actually based out of, the hardware is not really like the core market here. So in that sense, that's definitely true that getting into either of these countries like India or being in Scandinavia with a hardware background would have been quite difficult. But also on the other hand, I think I never had the passion of getting into industry, not at any point of time during my academic career, because I always, as I said, had passion for teaching, and I really wanted to sort of continue my career in research and academics. So that's always been my thought process, and I never looked into really going into industry then.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I was also referring to the constraints due to the nationality, requirements to work on space projects themselves.
Yes. Yeah. That's true. Yeah, that's very, very much true. And I think Europe is slightly relaxed in that sense with the constraints, and also, I mean, I should probably also say I have a Swedish citizenship, so that changes quite a lot. But yeah, definitely, nationality is a big constraint, and moving to US was definitely out of question. With my nationality, either with Indian or the Swedish.
Right. And what do you think? Given that you have some experience of knowing how things work in India, of course, and then you have now experience of being in Europe for quite a long time. What do you think are the contrasts when you look at it from not a researcher's perspective, but from an entrepreneur's perspective? What do you think you feel as different? What are the positives and the negatives on both the sides?
I think the biggest difference I've seen is the mindset or the cultural mindset, in Europe as compared to in India. I mean, I can take an example. I mean, if any one of us, if we take like our contacts, the extended contact network, I think we wouldn't come across we would maybe come across maybe a couple of guys who actually aspire to become an entrepreneur in India. I mean, at least for myself, I've never thought of becoming an entrepreneur anytime while I lived in India, because the way we have been brought up, the way we've been taught, doesn't actually sort of allow us to think through these risky manners or taking these risky steps. So we as traditionally, we are like not risk takers. So I think, but I mean, if you look at Europe, I think we would have already come across quite a lot of guys who are aspiring to become entrepreneurs, who are actually looking at, commercializing things at any point of time. So in that sense, I think the risk-taking mindset is the biggest difference, I would say. But probably that also, boils down to the way culturally we are, probably, and the way we are being, brought up throughout years. So that's the biggest difference. But also, I mean, on the positive side, I think India is now really changing, opening up quite a bit, and also I think the governmental policies are in a way that is actually much more suitable for starting up your own things, commercializing your own things. So in that sense, I think India is opening up quite a bit these days as compared to when we were, back in India. So that's a very positive thing, and I'm sure this is just going to grow up. And again, now given the talent base that India has, if India opens up not even like the full extent of Europe, but even half of it, I'm sure, I think that we will start seeing quite a lot of big companies, big world-class unicorns coming out of India, I would say.
Right. And in your venture, what are you trying to exactly do? ReOrbit, you talked about ReOrbit. Yes. And what is ReOrbit planning to do? And why do you think you are best placed to do this in Scandinavia, where you're located?
Yeah. So I would actually touch upon a couple of big issues that space industry is, going through today, and then associate what we are doing. So if you look at like the way the satellites are manufactured, particularly the satellites that are above 50 kilograms, so what we call like the microsatellites. So they are too bespoke, and two, the architectures are very much monolithic. So what this leads to is the most dreaded word in space community, the NRE, the non-recurring engineering cost. So today, if you look at like any of microsatellites, I mean, the non-recurring engineering cost is almost like 30%, or even sometimes like half of the total cost of a project. So that's a big issue today. And also, we also see that one of the primary reasons of the space debris, or the problem that we are facing, is also actually related to this monolithic architectures of satellite platforms. So these are the two biggest challenges that space or the satellite industry is facing today. So what we are trying to do is we are trying to address both these issues using a standardized common solution, what we call modularity and reusability. So when we mean modularity, what we are trying to do is like we are trying to modularize the platforms internally, where we treat hardware as a commodity. So we really don't want to reinvent the wheel that's already been there. And space industry today has a very strong supply chain of different vendors. So we don't want to reinvent the wheel as any other company is doing. But what we want to do is we want to build a software font and then just procure these hardwares based upon the requirements that we would get, and just plug them into this software layer, and then see to that we have this seamless integration of different hardwares that we procure and plug in. So we call this a software-defined spacecraft. So that's one part of it. And two, we are also making platforms reusable. So when we mean reusable, we're actually extending this modularity concept in orbit. So we are planning to make platforms that are in a distributed architecture in space. So either they fly very close to each other, or they are docked to each other, and then you are really modelizing these avionics, your payload, and so on and so forth. And let's say once your payload needs to be upgraded, then you could just undock your payload unit, launch just the payload unit and dock it, or fly in this formation flying. And similarly, if you, let's say one of your TNTC or your OBC is out of control, so you could just undock these units and then just dock a new OBC unit. So in that sense, you're reusing your platforms, you're extending your lifetime. So we think that's much more sustainable way of addressing the space debris issue as compared to like the most common solution that today people are going to, which is active debris removal. Because unless you don't have monetization for any solution, I don't see this thing going forward on the active debris front.
Right. And one of the things there, of course, is that while you are doing all of this, as an entrepreneur, you are looking to set up your business ground up, trying to find investors, trying to find employees, trying to find customers, and all of this. In your experience, within being in Finland and so on, and in Sweden and Finland, both the places and so on, how do you compare that to let's say if a next company in India comes up with this business plan, because today, you have companies in India also trying to build CubeSats, microsatellites, and so on. And in my opinion, India suffers from a sense of brand, related aspects. So, for example, you would call, India as an outsourcing hub for IT manufacturing or IT services and so on. But if it comes to space or so on, there's ISRO. ISRO has a very big name. It has a very reliable name. It has all the things that are attached to the, pride and, low cost and reliable and everything else. But unfortunately, Indian industry or the startup environment doesn't have the same tag. People don't recognize that in Europe. People can't even name one Indian company that works in the supply chain in Europe or US. That has been my experience. Do you think having that companies in India kind of suffer, at least this is your opinion in that sense, because we can't really know without us having companies done there, but generally having been in the industry for such a long time, do you think that is the suffering that these companies have, that you can overcome by like basing yourself abroad? That's what people do.
Yeah, that's definitely true. And I mean, I think one of the biggest sort of challenges for Indian startups is to raise your equity after a certain a level, because at least to best of my knowledge, probably there are very hardly few VC companies today in India. And also, if you look at these VC companies, what are do they have deep pockets? I mean, can they go beyond $10 million? Can they go beyond $20 million? Because if you have to start scaling up things and start getting your customer tractions, I think you need to have these kind of investments to go all out and start getting these kind of customers, especially on the hardware front, because hardware is a heavy upfront investment heavy business. So you need to have VCs who have these deep pockets, or at least governmental based venture capital firms coming out where they could start supporting these companies. I think that's probably one of the biggest challenges why we don't actually hear companies coming out of India and start selling outside Europe. And also, I mean, if you look at like space as a whole in India, on the private sector, I mean, I think it's relatively quite new as compared to Europe or US. So in that sense, probably the baseline is not exactly the same when we start comparing the Indian startups with European startups, because probably European startups they're not starting from zero. Maybe they're starting from 30 or 40 or 50 when you're running a 100 meters race. So if you maybe start drawing common baselines, probably Indian startups are doing better given the talent base and given the strong sort of heritage that they're taking from ISRO. But that being said, I would probably pinpoint to the investments. And also secondly is the way, I think, again, culturally we are brought up, our education system. I think that plays a huge role. That goes without saying. So and that's a bigger debate that we could have, how we could start evolving the educational system and stuff. But I would see like our entrepreneurship is strongly tied up with our education system, and that needs to change before we could start producing successful companies out of India.
Right. And is there a perception change in also the customers? Because, if I am a customer who's in US, and in your experience, even if it's AAC Clyde, for example, right, where you were previously working at, would they consider working with an Indian supplier prominently, or would they think there's not much we know about that supplier or that country and we can't trust the system, and we'd rather than work with a US supplier or whoever because they have contracted NASA and DoD have contracted them? That's again a big part of the perception gap.
Yeah, maybe I could speak for myself, not for AAC, but yeah, I think definitely there is this perception. I'm pretty sure there is this perception about engaging with Indian companies today as compared to, say, engaging in Europe, engaging in US. Again, this is primarily because they haven't seen successful companies coming out of India, and also given some sort of prejudice mindset of European companies. I think there is definitely this thing, but again, I think we could easily break away this kind of a perception mindset once, if you have some big companies coming out of India. I mean, I think probably if you look at like the way the IT sector has grown in India, I'm pretty sure in early 90s, people would have looked at Indian IT startups similar way as people are looking at us, space startups today. But then, given that the government has done quite a lot of investment, given that the growth has been quite exponentially high with the IT sector, now people look at India as a strong IT hub. I would again say that if we start producing some successful stories out of India, this perception could very well change. And there are already a couple of companies coming out right now with Agnicool and Bellatrix, Pixel. So in that sense, I'm sure this will definitely change as these start becoming quite successful.
Right. And there are, of course, today, novel joint ventures that are happening in India with, BST, for example, Berlin Space Technologies having with JV with Azista. And some of that mindset might change. And we've seen a recent announcement of even Nanoavionics or ISIS or, Saturn networks partnering with Indian companies and so on. So maybe, we are at the time when some doors are going to open, and through that, maybe some things are going to change eventually, but this will take time, of course.
Yeah, definitely. But also, I mean, I think everyone recognizes that going to India would definitely reduce cost on your personnel. So that's I think that's a baseline there. The only thing is, still you're now getting your supply chain from Europe or US. So your hardware is still driven, your hardware cost is still driven by the European cost and the American cost. So once you start getting, like, now you have these big platforms coming to India. Now once you have also the supply chain, if that starts building around these bigger tie-ups, this will eventually bring down the cost significantly. And then that will probably start opening up doors even more, much more aggressively, and then it's just a matter of time when this will happen, because as you said, they're now just in 2020 or 2019 to 2020, in a couple of years, there've been like quite a few European companies doing this JVs with quite a lot of Indian companies. So this is definitely going to kick off quite a few things.
So when you started your company idea and everything, of course, I believe that you're also somebody like an average Indian who comes from a pretty middle-class family, and you don't have, bags of cash that you're carrying around to kick off your company in that sense. But generally, what is the kind of support that you got when you started ReOrbit locally? And, before you got your first stage of investors, what is the kind of ground support you had, either in starting the business or getting your business plan, or, meeting with investors or others to take it to the next stage?
So initially, I would actually probably say it this way: the first support was basically from my family, because I just, when I started ReOrbit, I had a very small daughter. She's like 3 years old. But so I've been thinking about starting ReOrbit for like 6 or 7 months before I actually kicked off. And my wife, she being also a researcher, she sort of understood the nuances of actually doing these new things. So she really sort of gave me a strong support, saying that, she saw a value in it and you have to go with it. So I think that's the biggest support that I got, because without family supporting, I don't think I would have kicked off this. But that being said, we started ReOrbit in Sweden, but we didn't really have the kind of support we expected here in Sweden. So for the first 5 or 6 months, it's been me going around, speaking with investors and speaking with quite a few different countries as well, because the moment we saw that Sweden was not the place to be with kind of the support that we got here, so we really sort of realized that probably we have to go somewhere else outside Sweden. And that's where we felt Finland was quite interesting, because Finland was having big ambitions in space, and they already had a successful story with ISI, so they really sort of knew what it meant to invest in a space company. And then we were at I think it's called European Space Week in 2019, December 2019 in Finland. And then we happened to speak with a couple of the Finnish space agency, or there's this no Finnish space agency, but Business Finland, which takes care of Finnish space. So people and they really felt connected with our idea. And then we also got a couple of investors in Finland who were quite interested. And then we were also quite successful to actually convince one of the senior guy from ISI, so Ignacio, who's now our CTO. So he was then the VP of spacecraft at ISI. So we were quite successful in convincing him joining on board ReOrbit. So then it was a very natural choice because we had a Finnish investor, we had a Finnish CTO, and then we had like the support from the Business Finland. So we eventually moved to Finland. And then we raised our seed round in June this year. And then things started kicking off then. So we had about first 6 to 7 months, which was really quite passive on me running around, really trying to convince people around to see like why there is a big potential in this. But once people start recognizing it, things started actually just snowballing. So things started moving quite smoothly.
Right. And have you interacted with any of the Indian companies to either have them as a vendor to you, or perhaps have you supply stuff to them?
Yes, we did both. I mean, one of the sort of one of the thing that we have in our roadmap is to actually start us entering into India through JV or whatever, through like the other companies. So definitely engaging with Indian companies has always been there from day one. But firstly, on the supply chain side, as I said, like still the Indian supply chain is strongly dependent on European goods. So when we started speaking with quite a few of these vendors in India, we didn't really find a huge difference in pricing as compared to what we actually get here in Europe in terms of unit pricing. So in that sense, at least that's why I say like this has to evolve to really be competitive or to compete with European heritage. That's one. But also on the other side, engaging with potential customers, we are also speaking with quite a few guys or quite a few companies. And as things are growing now, we strongly see collaborations from our end kicking with quite a few Indian companies as well.
Right. And one of the aspects here, of course, is that there is a lot of give and take when it comes to policymakers helping startups and how frequently they listen to them to be able to change and to accommodate requests for all of this. How has been like your experience working with Business Finland and even many of the government officials there? I'm sure that given that Finland is a smaller country than India, the track to get to people and to have the conversation is much smaller. But are there any constraints in business that you see that affect you immediately, or nothing at all? Because if you look at Indian companies, they're all looking at getting a certainty in terms of getting access to the licensing required to access frequencies, or to sell their imagery, or to do any kind of business. Those are some of the uncertainties that also make investors hold back, right? So yes. What is it like to do business in Finland, for example, with this?
I mean, it's so Finland is a very small country, as you said. So it's also a very open country, meaning you could actually just take your phone and call to the head of Finnish space and just speak with him, which I don't think would be possible in any other country. So in that sense, doing business in Finland or in Scandinavia, I would actually generalize it because all the Scandinavian countries have pretty similar policies. So it's quite straightforward. So you could just reach out to the top decision maker and just say, hey, this is what we are facing through. So is there something that we could sit and discuss over a meeting? So in that sense, there are no real uncertainties that would come up with doing businesses more on the regulatory side of things in Finland. But then the constraints probably would be that quite a lot of investors are based in Central Europe or in US. So reaching out to these investors probably would then take a bit more time as compared to reaching out to the governmental agencies in Finland. So that would be probably the biggest constraints, but then that's probably the constraint for any other company which is based anywhere, right? So in that sense, I would say, like, as I said, moving to Finland has been like one of the best things that ReOrbit has done, given the ecosystem that's building up, and also given the emphasis Finland is putting into space, because there's a very clear direction that Finland has where the space will have to go and where they have to invest. So in that sense, I think Finland has a very clear view of how Finland is going to take space, and the best thing is that's communicated with every startup in Finland. So we all know what the government is thinking, and we could then align our strategies based on that.
And also, in fact, that as you said, Finland doesn't have a space agency as such doing a lot of the things by itself. And I think that is the problem with many countries that have legacy space institutions run by governments and government institutions who have built all of that. And today, because the commercial doors are becoming open for a lot of these, they have to, strike a balance in allowing private people to do whatever they want to do now, and at the same time maintain the operations and the missions that they were working on previously. And that's the case with many countries who are established space powers, including places like India and China as well. And that is, I guess, also one of the advantages that you might have being in Finland.
Definitely, that's definitely true. I completely agree with that. And also, since, I mean, if you take, like, since there is no space agency, I mean, the number of people working on space in Finland on the governmental side is probably handful of people. So you really know all of these guys, and then reaching out to them and just, again, as I said, speaking about policies and regulatories would be pretty straightforward. So you really get quite a good support of what you really want in being in this kind of countries.
From an investor's perspective, do you think because you are in such a country where everything is so accessible and policies are more certain and so on, that they never think of policy as a barrier to investment? Because I've had conversations with a lot of venture capitalists in India who I tried to not pitch my business, but basically asked them to consider investing in other space startups, or look at space as an area that they could invest as well. And their primary concern was that they were not very confident that the regulatory mechanisms needed for some of these companies to be successful will be fast enough in place for them to invest in, right? So that was one of the main concerns as to why they would not enter the sector to invest in.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, we have never had this dialogue actually popping up with any of the European investors or the American investors that we have been speaking with. So in that sense, yeah, I think people recognize that the policies are pretty open, and also there are no uncertainties attached. I wouldn't say not just like in Finland, but I think if you take across Europe, I think these policies are pretty standardized in that sense. So you don't really have quite a lot of uncertainties coming out. So we have never had that in that dialogue.
Right. And are there any overarching restrictions that come into your mind, that you have certain restrictions, or is the book open to its fullest extent?
Restrictions in which terms you mean?
In any trade terms, for example, if you, of course, are you based in India or in the US, for example, you will have restrictions to, let's say, do trade with China, for example. You cannot import a lot of stuff. You cannot sell a lot of stuff there. Are there any overarching restrictions for you to?
I mean, I would say, like, definitely ITAR is a big restriction, because today's space is so much US based. Somehow you will end up with some part in some of your supply chain that is coming from US. So definitely that's a big restriction. I mean, in fact, I think China is now really, there's a big business in China available, but then you just simply can't do, because maybe you're just procuring a small computer from US, and then that really stops everything. But again, being modular the way we are thinking on the architecture side, platform architecture side, actually we could get around those restrictions quite a bit on the ITAR side, because you could then sort of standardize certain solutions for say China, with running over the ITAR regulatories. So in that sense, I think we are in a far better position to getting around these kind of ITAR regulations. But other than that, I haven't, at least we haven't had any such kind of restrictions, or we don't foresee any such kind of restrictions being based off of where we are today in Finland or in Europe.
Right, and if you have been following some of the conversations that all of the NewSpace startups in India have been having with the government, it's to get a lot of the policies into place and giving recommendations. And they formed a new association for new space companies called Space Federation of India, and all of these things. So these are, the evolution of how industry is being formed in India. I know that, in where you are today, you have quite a lot of mature startups, including ISI and, many others that are present. What is the general expectation between these startups that are, around you in your ecosystem against the government, against the contrast of what is happening, for example, with some of the startups in India?
Yeah, I would say one, having an open policy from government helps quite a bit for us as startups based in Scandinavia or in Finland particularly, because then you clearly know that these are the things that the government makers want, and these are the things that they clearly don't want. So then if we start, if we decide to actually be getting some institutional money or being dependent a bit on governmental fundings, then we know that what we shouldn't go into, and we know what we have to go into. So in that sense, that helps quite a bit, having this open policy and very standardized regulations, and having this open communication, because we get sent with, whenever there's a change in policy, when there's change in expectations, we are communicated with that pretty openly. So that helps for us. So we could always, in a way, plan our strategy, in a way plan our roadmaps according to that. But when it comes to India, I think the biggest issue, as you said, is government being probably not very open and vocal about the policies. I completely agree on that, because then that sort of kicks back to your investment ecosystem. It kicks back to your own policies. I mean, you can then not start planning where you have to put your investments, where you shouldn't put your investments as a company. So that's definitely a big sort of drawback. But also, with given the complexity with Indian governance, I think one should expect this. But also, on the other hand, having these kind of I would say, like, ecosystem based communities really helps, because that's something, at least in Finland, startups have been really pushing for, because now we are having this ecosystem based communities where these are very informal communities, but still we have this opportunity to meet with 7 different startups that are located in Finland and start discussing what we could then propose to the institutions to change, and then that really helps, and evolving and empowering these ecosystem based communities is much more of value. So when I mean empowering, either put them as an advisory on certain governmental things, so that would really drive things forward in a much more efficient way, but also probably that brings quite a lot of stability to the investors as well.
One of the biggest challenges, of course, is that the local market is a big change between India and other countries, especially in Europe, because India, in that sense, is a kind of a pristine market which is unexplored in that sense for space applications, because government is only able to do some applications that are mostly government to government, or disaster management, or some small applications like telemedicine or so on, restricted to certain pockets. But you need the commercial companies to come up to serve a lot of the other markets that are evolving today in Earth observation or communications or so on, like you see today with Airtel, or even SpaceX planning to enter India to a large extent, and Amazon and everybody else, right? So there's a large enough local market for people to come and now explore certain end user services that are based on space related stuff, and that presents itself as an opportunity once the regulatory barriers come up and they are solved, and they actually can open up that market to these people to come and invest and also to provide that services. And I guess that is the main challenge for any of us who've started companies in Europe or many other places, because we have to rely a lot on the export markets to find our customers.
That's very true. I mean, the likelihood of actually producing the next space unicorn is actually India, because given the magnitude of the end users you have, that it's a big market. So the likelihood of producing a big company or next big company is from India. But then there are a couple of strings attached to it, right? I mean, one is, as I said, the way the governments would behave, so that going forward, so that really sort of decides how these startups would start scaling up. That's one. But two, also I would say, like, our human resources, meaning how we as a society would start evolving with this I don't know, digital revolution or the space revolution that's going to come up. So because we have traditionally been sort of seeing space as something that we can never enter into, because at least I myself, when I was a kid, was always sort of interested with space, but I never had idea how I could enter into space. So that sort of kept quite a lot of people away from this market. But I think that's changing, and then we have to also see how would this evolve, and then how would the mindset of people change on that front. So that will also govern this scaling up of these startups becoming quite successful.
Right. And as an entrepreneur who is from, let's say, in India and living in Europe, for example, there are some opportunities that I see between India and US. For example, there is the Indo-US Science and Technology Forum that presents an opportunity to link up with India to do joint projects and so on. But at the moment, as far as space is concerned, there's very little exchange also possible, between countries as well. And that is also something I see as an opportunity to kind of tackle and to present itself as an instrument, because European Space Agency has instruments that are restrictive to Europe. And there could be some joint instruments, like they do joint missions between space agencies, that basically space agencies and government can set these joint instruments where it'll set the tone for partners who have complementary skill sets to work together. So in your case, you may be a producer of a bus or a satellite in itself, and an end user in India can be rolling out certain solutions based on this. And governments, to create that sort of a model where both the parties kind of benefit, having complementary stuff, may actually be explored, and it's actually very little explored at the moment.
Yes, that's very true. And also, I mean, the reason for that is today's space is still predominantly defense based. I mean, if you look at like space today, it's predominantly US based, and then within US it's predominantly defense based. So that really closes up quite a bit of market or to the end users. So, or making it much more restrictive. So in that sense, I think Europe is in a quite unique position, because when it comes to Europe, space is not so much defense driven, but more application driven in Europe. So in that sense, I see actually quite a lot of synergies between potential relationships between Indian customers with European supply chain, and I'm sure this has already been sort of explored, because India is now signing up collaborative agreements with, for instance, France. I think there's been one with Sweden a few years ago, Germany. So I think India has probably recognized that, and also Europe has recognized that. But then it's upon the startups and the commercial entities to then come up with new ideas and make use of these agreements and take this market forward, both in Europe and in India. So I really see a strong synergy between the Indian and the European counterparts, rather than US and the Indian counterparts.
Right. And one of the interesting aspects here is that the cultural aspects that we talked about, there's also an interesting insight there, right? Because when you look at a country like US, look at the non-space market, like IT industry or other industries, you will find a tremendous amount of successful Indian immigrants heading those companies, including like Google or Microsoft or many others, right? And In fact, this is something that is interesting that I was remarking with one of my family members, and he's based here in Europe, and he was saying that I don't know why I cannot raise to a level of heading a European company, because traditionally you need to have the cultural background, the language background, and many other insights to work with the board of an established company to be there. And it's a very slow phenomena. I mean, there are now some immigrant entrepreneurs or immigrant workers who have risen to head companies in Europe, which are primarily European brands, but it's a very slow phenomena considering what has happened in the US. But in our case, we are really talking about startups in this sense, as in where people can start by being immigrants like yourself, for example, right? In that case. But what I wanted to know from you is that is there any change in attitude or change in the approach if you are an immigrant that you faced being there, or because you are basically a trained scientist, although you are an immigrant, that increased your value or your perception of yourself with the others? How did it really work out for you?
It's quite a tricky question, right? So I would say, like, having the educational background that I have definitely helps in reaching out to certain people, which otherwise wouldn't have been possible. So I would put it that way. So definitely, the strong educational background helped me quite a bit to reach out to some people. So in that sense, probably if there was some other immigrant entrepreneur who wants to do, probably not space, any other startup with a limited educational background and a limited overview of how things are here, probably I'm sure he or she would face more difficulties than I would have faced. So in that sense, I would say, like, probably I was a bit more lucky enough to have the kind of background I have. That's one. But also, I mean, culturally, there's quite a lot you need to adopt being in Europe as compared to, say, being in US, because especially in Scandinavia, because you have a very strong social system here. I mean, you cannot really ask people to do certain things that you could actually take for granted in India. I mean, for instance, you cannot ask people to work after 5. I mean, so there's a strong regulatory thing. And then you have the strong social element. You always put, like, you need to have a work-life balance, pretty strong work-life balance across Europe. So in that sense, you have to start adopting to these things. And also, given that I've been living in Sweden for like 10 years or 9 years before I started ReOrbit, so that helps me because I spent almost 1/3 of my life here now. So I've, in a way, I know, like, what people expect here, what things have to be done, how things have to be done. So that really helps. So there's definitely this cultural barrier, but I would say, like, adopting from Indian background to an European background is much more easier than adopting it to the other way around, because we are used to working sometimes like 15 hours a day, and now you come here and work probably 6 hours a day sometimes. I mean, it's quite easy to adopt. I mean, also remember, like, when I started my PhD, so I was actually especially asked by my PhD supervisor not to work after 5 because I was quite used to working until late nights, and he really forced me not to work after 5 and not take care of this work-life balance. So in that sense, I would say there are quite a lot of things you should adopt, but I think that would sort of, you learn this as you be in the society.
Yeah, I mean, that is always an interesting aspect, because even for me, in that matter, our company is based in the Netherlands, but I don't do any of the aspects directly related to government and so on. But I also wouldn't know where to really start in that sense, because you need to have, like, the local networks and language to go after. It can be a disadvantage if you're looking for access to government related affairs. But if you're a pure play commercial company, I think you don't need to bother at all.
No, definitely not. But also, I mean, the small things, right? I mean, when you start, you need to really know how to actually set up an entity, legal entity in Sweden or in Netherlands. Then you need to be able to go to the website and read and understand the content of it. And most probably, mostly it will be in the local language. So you really need to understand the nuances of what is there. So there are quite a lot of small things that you need to get right, because if you don't have your legal entity in a proper structure, then you're going to face legal issues ultimately later in the day. So in that sense, there have been quite a lot of small things that really helped me being in this society for like 9 years or so.
Right. And one of the aspects here, again, which is interesting, is from a product price perspective. Because the moment when I talk to somebody and say that my company is based in the Netherlands and we have colleagues in 3 or 4 different countries, they immediately ask me, why don't you open a development center in India or hire 5 people for the cost of 1 in Europe and everything else. That's the usual conversation that I get from a lot of people back home, especially like friends and family and so on. So from your perspective, what do you think of this? Because I believe that for me personally, time zone is a very big challenge. If you have colleagues in different time zones and you are from different planes, the cost really is also an indicative of certain amount of quality as well. And a certain amount of reach that you can have in terms of trust and people. So at least for young companies, because we are not like the Microsofts or the outsourcing businesses in the world where you can hire in the thousands and have these massive workforces.
Yeah, no, I also get this quite a bit. Why don't you start in India and you could cut down your human resource costs significantly. I definitely hear that. But also, I mean, then if you actually sit back and look at the companies that are already there and producing certain avionics for space vendors. So we did actually speak with quite a few of them, and then if you put the prices next to like the prices that you get from European vendors, they're not so different. I mean, so in fact, they're actually pretty similar, because all of these guys are dependent on a certain SRAM that comes from US. So, and that drives like 70% of the cost of this product. So ultimately, I see like the cost is strongly driven by hardware and quality of the hardware rather than the human resources, because the human resources cost is ultimately probably 20% of it. And then here you could in a way find people that are already trained to producing certain things because of the strong heritage that you have in Europe. But probably in India, you have to maybe spend 5 years or 3 years of time to train certain human resources to have similar kind of products produced. So ultimately it boils down to similar prices. So in that sense, I really don't see so much difference at this point, based on the argument that you could reduce the cost of your human resources. But I see a strong value once you start producing a strong supply chain within India. Then I think it makes quite a lot of difference, because then you're no more dependent on the same product that other European countries are dependent on. So then you could reduce the cost. So unless India doesn't start investing in that front, I don't see a huge competitive value on the price.
And one of the interesting aspects, again, there is the element of how much tax you put on imports. I remember, 10 years back, if you wanted to import a lot of the things, as you said, SRAM is one example that you gave, but most often, most of the foundation sensors, the foundation material out there that are all not produced in India. India has a very good build to print manufacturing, PCB manufacturing, that kind of a base. But when it comes to the core components itself, there's hardly anybody who actually produces anything there. And in fact, I still remember, I don't know if the policies have changed, but normally there's like a 30% tax on importing a lot of this. And most often, a lot of these European companies have free trade agreements, or there are no such import taxes with US and other places, which means that you almost directly save the 30% of the hardware anyways, because you have to pay that 30% to the government in India.
Yeah, definitely, I agree. Yeah, again, government regulatory is a big thing, right? Yeah, definitely, and not just tax. Also, I mean, just having uncertainties around policy also increases your cost in a way. So definitely there's always this element, because if you have a very standard and stable policy that you already know of, then you could work towards reducing certain costs. So this definitely adds up on top of the 30% tax you're saying. So and that's why, in a sense, the product cost or the hardware cost always overdrives the human resources cost significantly. So therefore, the savings that you would incur in the human resources is really overshadowed by all the other hardware and the tax and the regulatory costs.
Right. And how big is government procurement in itself help to you? Because one of the major aspects as to why many companies in US become successful is that the US government acts as a customer in that sense. And this is a problem that we see even in India, even with the new space movement that is happening today. I think most of the people in the government expect these companies to rely on foreign capacity or foreign people buying a lot of their products, and if there's a launch vehicle company, they're expecting some foreign satellites to be launched on it through these Indian startups, and not really Indian satellites being launched or Indian government defense satellites or whatever XYZ mission. Or it's the same case if you are building a satellite. I guess most often they're looking at foreigners using those Indian capacity, and this as a export related activity that the government would like to encourage. But then is this the same in Sweden? Do you think, is there a balance where governments give a certain leverage, or is it then pure play, you have to look for commercial business abroad?
So one thing I would actually first comment this from ReOrbit's perspective. So at least when I started ReOrbit, the first thing, at least, or the two things I really sort of put down as a pillar of ReOrbit. So one, detaching from the government's money as much as possible, because we have seen today quite a lot of companies being over dependent on governmental money. So what this really makes is that you start getting into a cycle of just catering to government needs, which probably are not exactly what the market needs. So in that sense, shifting from that towards a commercial need requires quite a lot of upfront investment again to make that balance. So that I have seen through my experience, and that's something we at ReOrbit will definitely don't want to get into. And lucky enough, now we are sort of finding some traction on the commercial side. So that's one. And two, also, I think Finland is in a way I could speak up for Finland. So Finland is also quite sort of keen on pushing the companies to start commercializing things and not be dependent on the governmental money. So they actually sort of they actually have a metric to measure each euro that a company gets from government to each euro that the company brings into Finland. So they measure based on this metric, and then that sort of gives us as a company a clear direction that, okay, for instance, if this metric is like 20, where if they give us €1, we have to bring in 20 euros back as an export. So we know, okay, this is how things are going to work, and then we could plan our strategies in that way. So again, it sort of ultimately boils down to Finland being a bit more open in communicating their strategy, and two, also us as ReOrbit, we are quite open in communicating internally that we will definitely not be dependent on the governmental money.
Right. And from that, what is it from a talent perspective that you think is locally available? Because we know that a lot of the Indians, of course, we have a huge engineering base in India, a lot of young engineers. Of course, the signal to noise ratio in India is very difficult to achieve. We have thousands of people who want to enter into space, but don't have the skill set that is required. It's mostly like fascination to enter the space sector rather than the skill necessary to get into work into companies. How was it like for you to look at local talent? And do you think, I've seen actually a lot of companies in Europe starting to hire a lot of Indian students who have basically come over to Europe and have studied here, and that's also worked out quite well for them.
Yeah. So firstly, I think I'll actually again go back to my PhD years and probably relate this to what you asked. So one thing what PhD taught me is that you could always learn new things if you have the ability to learn and if you have the interest to learn. So because as a PhD student, you're always continuously learning something new. So this has strongly sort of struck in me. So when we wrote like the ReOrbit's hiring policy or let's say the talent building policy, what we have decided is that we are just looking at people who have the passion for space, one, and who have the ability to learn fast, an ability to fail fast and learn fast again from that failure. So that's precisely what we are looking at. So we are really not looking at people who have strong experience in space and stuff. Okay, if they do have, that's a bonus. But what we are really looking at is someone who's so much passionate about what we are doing, and someone who's really ready to learn fast and fail and learning from these failures. So in this process, we actually already been looking at a couple of people from India who never had experience working here. And in fact, one of them actually don't even have masters. He has just completed his bachelor. So we are looking at that kind of talent where we really find them interesting because they are quite smart. They're quite eager to learning. So that's what we are looking at. So in that sense, India is a huge talent base there because you have quite a lot of these people. But then there's also this signal to noise ratio that you have to be careful enough to figure out. But then I think you also have methodologies to figure these ratios. So you could put some high pass and low pass filters that you could get through these noises. So we are doing that. But getting like locally, we also see like since ISA has grown up like pretty fast and pretty big in pretty rapid time, this has attracted quite a lot of talent into Finland. And there's not just ISA, there's also Aurora Technologies, which is growing very much rapidly these days. So this has also attracted quite a bit of talent. And also in Sweden, there's traditionally been this OHP and also AAC. So there's also been a strong talent here. So there's a huge local talent here in Sweden and Finland, which we are always lucky to just onboard these people.
So what would make you consider India as a destination to also have a base or so on? I know that you talked about the JV potential partner and so on, but I'm just trying to get a perspective of why would entrepreneurs want to return back to India, or potential entrepreneurs who are researchers like yourself, for example, have got a lot of insight into what they want to build in the future. And in the future, maybe there's enough potential for them to return back to India and to start off there. How would you think that picture would look like?
I think this is, I mean, the people coming from abroad into India is growing, especially in like past few years. I do know like quite a lot of my colleagues who started PhDs after me, they're going back to India because things are changing quite a bit on research front today. I mean, for instance, I think government is investing in research funded projects, mainly like IISCs or IITs, and then their IITs and IISCs are quite open. But also I do know like there are quite a lot of private universities who are actually self-investing in research. So I know like a couple of private universities in Chennai and Delhi who are actually putting their own resources and funding certain R&D projects. So people are recognizing that, building a strong research ecosystem is a way forward to building a strong society, both on the entrepreneur side and also building a strong society on every other front, right? So I think government is recognizing it and people are recognizing it. And this is definitely going to improve. So this is definitely going to bring in quite a lot of people who have settled in India back to Europe. But then there are also quite a lot of other stuff that needs to evolve. One, we spoke about governmental policies being more stable, being more inclusive. When I mean inclusive, taking all the stakeholders into a decision making rather than just taking a decision and then just communicating it to the stakeholders, which sometimes happens in India, right? So that's, I think, one of the major thing when it comes to startup side, but also on the research side, it's quite important that government start, shaking up a bit on the educational system or the basis of our educational system, because the way our educational system is today, I don't, at least this is again my personal view, I don't see it sustainable going forward or taking India into the leadership position that India is aspiring to be, because you have to, in addition to the knowledge-based education system we have today, you need strong experience-based and educational system, and also you need to sort of inculcate a bit more daringness into the educational system, and rather than just putting them into a cocoon. So and that has to be shaken up a bit to really attract the talent that is already in Europe or US back into India.
Right. So it's been an hour already. I'll let you go soon with the one last final question in that sense.
Yes.
what is your perspective, 3 to 5 years down the line, that things would look at as the NewSpace India ecosystem evolves? How would you think it would have evolved from your perspective? Because you see things happening in India, you see things happening in Europe. I would want you to give your perspective on how you see things evolve in the next 3 to 5 years.
Yeah, so there is one assumption. Okay, assuming that the governmental policies are a bit more inclusive, I think it could take time, but as long as they're inclusive, I would definitely see quite a lot of startups coming out of India. That's one. Then it's a matter of question, how many of these startups are on the hardware side, meaning the supply chain side. So if the supply chain starts growing, I see a strong potential of quite a lot of business that's done in Europe and US shifting into India, especially on the space front.
So Sethu, thank you very much for taking so much of your time in this episode. I think this is the first time I've actually had an Indian entrepreneur who is having a business abroad to speak about his perspective in the podcast, and to talk about what are the pros and cons, and what are interesting in terms of learning why people start businesses abroad, and how it could be also, what would make them to go back to India, and so on. So it's been a very insightful episode and very insightful conversation. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I appreciate as well. And thanks for inviting me again. It's been my pleasure talking with you and sharing my experiences. Thank you.